Greetings, everybody, and I wanted to welcome Mr. Masaaki Shirakawa. He was the governor of the Bank of Japan from 2008 through 2013. And before that, he spent a long career at the bank, probably about 35 years or so.
The 39 years, including governorship.
Including the governorship, right. Okay, so, and indeed, just last month, Mr. Shirakawa published a book called Tumultuous Times, Central Banking in an Era of Crisis. This just came out in English last month. It's available on Amazon and elsewhere. It's a really great book, not only about the content of current economies, monetary policy, and those types of issues, but also what it was really like to be inside a central bank during this period of great change of central banking itself. So I highly recommend it to everybody out there. Now he is currently the distinguished guest professor at Aoyama Gakuin University in Tokyo, and he is also a member of the Group of 30. So once again, Mr. Shirakawa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to start with a short summary of one of the key arguments in your book. Okay, in this book, Tumultuous Times, you noted that low economic growth, low inflation, and low interest rates are common across most of the world, even though central banks have really done more than easing than anybody really thought was possible a few decades ago. Can you please explain this puzzle to us? Why do we have super easy policy, but we still have very low inflation and very low economic growth?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for your advertisement on my book. And what you said, what you described is seemingly a puzzle. But if we consider the mechanism of how monetary easing works, it is not bubble. It is not a puzzle. Rather, it is, I would say, self-evident. The effectiveness of monetary easing is essentially two. One is to front-load future demand to the present by engineering very accommodating monetary condition. Of course, this works, but its effectiveness naturally diminishes as monetary easing is prolonged because demand that could be front-loaded diminishes over time. We cannot count on this mechanism indefinitely. The other mechanism is to bring demand home away from foreign countries by engineering depreciation of its own currency. But by definition of exchange rate, this mechanism doesn't apply to all countries. A case in point is Japan, where interest rate is the lowest at the level of zero interest rate at the height of global financial, at the start of global financial crisis. Nonetheless, if we continue with monetary easing, what will happen globally? That is what we are now observing. And this argument does apply to inflation as well. By inducing demand from future to the present, it could raise the price level today relative to price level tomorrow. But as a consequence, price level of tomorrow will decline. And so what monetary easing could produce is the rise of the level of price, not inflation itself. And I'm not saying that monetary easing is not meaningless. Of course, monetary easing is meaningful, but it works if the shock hitting the economy is transitory. Mm-hmm. And but the shock, which, for instance, Japanese economy was hit over the decades, was not that transitory demand shortfall. The most important factor was the rapid aging and declining population. And given this, just tinkering with the timing of expenditure could not increase growth rate could not increase inflation. That is my reading of the situation.
Okay, that's interesting. Then does that mean that there's some way in which the very prolonged monetary easing in response to structural factors like demographics that you mentioned, does it somehow cause inflation to be lower in the future? If we get a bump up of the price level in the near term, but then it's going to go down again?
Frankly speaking, our knowledge, I mean, and the academics and policy makers do not know the complex dynamics of inflation. And just now, I focus on the timing of expenditure induced by monetary easing. This is one aspect of inflation dynamics. But we can think of different dynamics. For instance, if central bank is engaged with massive monetary easing with purchasing of government bond, and if market participants perceive that central bank is forced to monetize government bond in order to save government finance, then inflation will be forthcoming. And so we have to look at how and in what condition central banks are doing monetary easing. And again, this is not for story, but that's my interpretation.
I see. Okay, then maybe would fiscal policy, which many countries are now considering, especially in the US, is that likely to be any more successful at raising inflation on a more permanent, lasting basis?
If the only purpose of macroeconomic policy is just to raise inflation rate, a combination of a truly aggressive monetary policy and truly aggressive fiscal policy might be an answer. But in this case, the mechanism which brings about inflation is simply the loss of confidence of central bank and government. And the resulting inflation is not mild deflation, such as 2% inflation, which economists is envisioning. Rather, it's a rampant or hyper inflation. And I don't think this inflation is hoped for by economists and many people. So we have to think about why inflation is needed. And standard argument is to have monetary policy space in order not to slip into zero interest rate. And then economists say, in the presence of zero interest rate, fiscal policy is effective. Maybe so, but if fiscal policy is effective, then why on earth do we need 2% inflation rate, which is justified on the ground of having policy space? So, we have to think about why inflation is needed in a deep sense.
I see. Well, that's, I mean, this sounds kind of like a minority view because certainly most people think we need 2% inflation. It seems there's a very strong consensus on that. Even though some observers, like, for example, Larry Summers, now say that perhaps central banks might not be able to control the rate of inflation so easily. So is your view still very much a minority, or do you think it's being, the conventional wisdom is being questioned more now?
Yes, my view is a minority one. But and judging from what central bankers and academics are saying publicly, of course, as I said, my view is minority. But I'm not sure whether those academics and policymakers are believing wholeheartedly in what they are saying publicly. And they might have some uneasy. They have some uneasy feeling with interpreting this situation, and there could be three hypotheses on the response of central banks and academics. One is some of them are literally believing what they are saying. Some of them are of two minds, and some of them do not believe in what they are saying. But even so, they are united in expressing themselves to outside world. And a couple of hypotheses are conceivable. First, as with any institution, groupthink might be prevailing. The second, a lack of alternative theory. And once policymakers express somewhat agnostic view about how inflation rate is determined, then the financial market participant might anticipate the change in monetary policy strategy, which lasted for past 2 decades. Of course, this could rattle financial market. So they are fearful of that kind of reaction. And third, a fear of the loss of central bank independence. Inflation targeting framework is a hallmark of the independent central bank. And this is very important international institutional underpinnings of underpinning central bank independence. And independence calls for accountability. And inflation targeting, inflation rate, was a major part of this accountability device or framework. And if central bank say we don't know how inflation rate is determined, then the very basis of accountability could be eroded, which leads to the loss of independence. I don't think this is right argument, but this might be one hypothesis. And so various factors are involved in this current situation.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, well then let me bring it a little bit more to the present because in the last couple of months, we've actually had fairly high inflation in many countries. It has not been very long, and certainly the Fed and most other central bankers say it's likely to be temporary. But do you think it's likely to be temporary? What are the causes? Or is it another one of these short-lived rises of inflation that then fades away that we've seen over the last few decades?
On this issue, I do not have a unique view. And on the one hand, I have some sympathy with transitory school. And the factors which push up prices seems to be natural. And the current rise in inflation rate is basically due to the returning of the economy to normalcy. And in that process, the supply side bottleneck is created. The oil price is increasing. But eventually, we are hoping that the economy will go back to the normalcy. And if so, those pressure will be gradually disappearing. So in that sense, I have some sympathy with transitory school. But as I said, our knowledge on inflation dynamics is quite limited. So I do not stick with what I said just now. And equally, we have to have concern over other things. Case in point is financial stability. And given financial imbalances are accumulated globally, we have to have a legitimate concern over financial stability. And also, I'm concerned about monetary easing induced decline in productivity. As I said, the the mechanism of monetary easing is essentially based on front loading of future demand to the present. And in this process, for instance, investment is undertaken in the expectation of profitability. And naturally, productive investment will be undertaken first. So over time, less productive investment will be undertaken, which means lower growth of productivity. And also, the aggressive monetary easing could suppress credit spread, which hampered efficient allocation of credit. And on top of that, zombie farm might be allowed. And all in all, the current prolonged monetary easing have some mechanism for gradually lowering productive growth. And in this case, of course, this is a slow-moving picture, but we have to be concerned about this kind of scenario as well. So my bottom line is we have to be open-minded.
Okay. Well, then this sounds like there's, there is a criticism in the market that central banks are doing too much and that they're possibly creating asset bubbles, maybe even inflation. They may have to raise interest rates faster if indeed inflation gets out of control. Do you think that that's a large risk?
Yes. You framed your question in terms of inflation and the risk of inflation, the risk of financial instability in future. And my point is what I want to emphasize is central banks has to be alert to that kind of risk. And when I'm observing the current policy debate, my impression is people are so focused on inflation. And some people are saying the central bank are too naive about the risk of inflation. And others say, no, this inflation is transitory. But these arguments are framed in terms of inflation. But inflation is one aspect of currency stability. And my argument is both price stability and financial stability are two faces of the same coin, currency stability. And what people are asking central bank to play role is currency stability. And in this environment, people do not have to worry about price level in the long run. If people lose faith in the price level, then economic agent cannot do rational economic calculus.
I see. Okay. I mean, it's again, you were at a central bank for 39 years, including at the Bank of Japan, and I'm sure that being having criticism of central banks is part of the job. I just wonder. It seems that compared to the past, the criticism appears to be more intense in the current environment. Do you think that the criticism will likely change the consensus on central bank goals and this need for central bank independence in order to pursue these goals?
The current situation is very serious, and I think the criticism has been intense over the decade and will continue to be so for three reasons. First, the independent central bank can take actions quickly without getting approval of the parliament, unlike the government or fiscal policy. The second, government is in political impasse because society is so divided over various issues. And third, given these, central bank themselves feel obliged to do something if macroeconomy is not performing well. And the current situation is created by this kind of complex dynamics. And distinction between what central bank can do and what central bank cannot do is not so clear, especially in the short run. So as central banks become more aggressive, society becomes accustomed to it gradually, which creates further demand on central bank. And if central banks goes too far, eventually the backlash will be forthcoming, because in this case, central bank is stepping into the sphere of political nature or fiscal nature. So we have to be careful.
Wow. So it sounds as if sometimes society is expecting too much out of the central bank.
Yeah,
basically.
And the difficult thing is in this case, central bank is not forced to do what society is asking, and central bank feel obliged to do something because everything can be translated into macroeconomy or price development. So if use that kind of logic too far, then gradually central bank feels feel obliged, and that is very strange dynamics.
Okay, great. So the Japanese title of your book was more like my 39 years as a central banker. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that experience. The reason why is that most investors and the general public really does not know what's going on inside a central bank. And in your book, you note that there's a very strong orthodoxy, and you just discussed that within the central bank circles. And even though some people like Larry Summers have talked about the failure of monetary policy to raise inflation, when central bankers get together, they still seem to really believe in the orthodoxy. You mentioned the three different types, but I guess the question is there any really fundamental rethinking of the role of a central bank, of what can be accomplished with central bank's tools? Does daylight really get inside the walls of a central bank?
Okay, my self-assessment or my argument is that I belong to Orthodox school in the long history of central banking. And say 100 years ago, the central bankers or people are not talking about monetary policy. In those days, the word of monetary policy itself was not existing. And in my understanding, the fundamental role of central banks is to foster monetary and financial environment conducive to sustainable economic growth. And this is translated, could be translated into price stability and financial stability or currency stability. And it is a new phenomena that central banks focus on inflation rate, say at 2%. It's a new tradition. And I'm not saying that price stability is not important. Of course, price stability is important. But this price stability is the state which is achieved in the long run time span. And so just minutes ago, I said central bank had two mandates: price stability and financial stability. But frankly speaking, I did not like this typology. And for me, the objective is one, currency stability, or the stable monetary and financial environment. And if we are pressured to divide or classify, then I would say price stability and financial stability. So my short answer to the question is we do not need fundamental rethinking of central banking. Rather, we have to recall what central banks are expected to perform. And the country, what we are asked is how to operationalize what I said. And the how to operationalize my thinking is, of course, not that easy. But this is what central banks are now tackle with.
Okay, very good. Let's think about another central bank. I wanted to ask about China just for a second, because China's monetary system is, I think, quite different from those of other advanced countries. It's more quantity-based. It emphasizes the exchange rate more than most other advanced countries, I would say. But the Chinese economy has continued to grow pretty well despite everything, even though there's high debt, the state role in the economy is very strong, COVID. Do you think that China is stable? And do you think that there's lessons for China from Japan's monetary and economic history?
Okay, each country has its own problem. So I do not think the lessons of Japanese economy are useful for China in a mechanical way. But nonetheless, the Japanese experience could provide food for thought for Chinese policy makers. And in this light, the most important lesson is how a country makes a transition from high growth to stable growth. And specifically, I would like to point to three things. One is the demographic change. By this, I mean both rapid aging and declining population due to low birth rate. China is following Japan with a lag of 20 years. And second is how to manage the rise of social frustration due to gradually declining growth rate. In a growing economy, the political decision is about allocation of gain. But in a decreasing growth rate society, the role of political decision is about how to allocate the burden, which is more difficult. In the case of Japan, it took the form of allocation between the elderly and the young people, the allocation between the metropolitan Tokyo and local community, which is losing population. And the third is a conflict with the rest of the world, which is due to still high growth. And in the case of Japan, the economic trade and investment dispute with US was the serious factor. And currently we are seeing the conflict between China and the US. And so all these factors are involved in the transition from high growth to moderate growth. And of course, China has a different political system. So I don't say that what happened in Japan happened in China in the same manner, but the nature of the problem itself is the same.
Got it. Okay. I also wanted to ask about debt, because debt levels across the world are very high. You wrote about this in many places of your book. This is partially a result of the borrowing demand from the future effect that you explained at the beginning. Can interest rates rise given how much debt there is? And is this why some economies seem very sensitive to even quite small increases of interest rates?
Okay, as we are observing in developing and emerging market economies, the rise in interest rate is impacting on those economies. And when we look at the advanced economies, as we discussed, prong material easing is there. But eventually, if the debt level is too excessive, this situation is adjusted anyway. And in the economy, after adjustment is made, the interest rate have to be higher than otherwise. Otherwise, the the equilibrium is not restored. So eventually, interest rate will go up, and how interest rate go up is very complex. And based upon past experience, oftentimes it starts from the weakest link of the global economy. So we have to be careful.
Okay, great. Then just finally, I wanted to ask a few questions about crypto, which is, I think, in some degree related to central banking. We know that the most popular cryptocurrency, which is Bitcoin, initially became popular because people felt that it's not subject to inflation, like fiat currencies with independent with central banks. So if inflation stays high over the next, it's not as transitory as most central bankers think it will be. Do you think that crypto is going to gain popularity because it seems like a hedge against inflation?
I did not rule out such possibility, but the increase in popularity is not due to the attractiveness of Bitcoin as currency. This is just due to the attractiveness of Bitcoin as a speculative asset. And so we have to distinguish between the issue of currency and the issue of asset, which serves the purpose of speculation or hedging against inflation risk. And the issue is the volatility associated with Bitcoin. And in order for currency to serve its purpose, we have to have the mechanism for supplying the the currency or asset in question. And in the case of Bitcoin, we are lacking in such mechanism. So I do not think, anyway, Bitcoin will gain popularity as currency.
Okay, then you touched upon some kind of theoretical issues. I wanted to ask, do you think that central banks should have a monopoly on the supply of money? I know that you admire Milton Friedman, and even though obviously Milton wanted to keep the government out of the economy as much as possible, I believe he did favor government control of money. So I wanted to hear your thoughts.
First on minor point, I studied at the University of Chicago, and I took Milton Friedman's last class, but I'm not admirer of Milton Friedman, although I respect his great works. And on your question, it depends, my answer depends on how we define government control. And the current monetary system is already hybrid system of government money or public money and private money. If we look at the ratio of private money, I mean the deposit with private banks by the individuals and corporate, most part of the money is private money. And if we look at asset side of banks, then the asset is directed toward the lending. So this means that credit allocation is done by private banks. In that sense, current system is already private system, but the value of private money is sometimes questioned. And if people think that this and that bank is not safe, then people will withdraw the deposit to get cash, meaning central bank money. And without having absolutely safe currency, the monetary system is essentially unstable. That's why the central bank is monopolizing on the issue of currency today. And this aspect will remain the same. So in that sense, central bank or the society is central bank is monopolizing. But as I said, current monetary system is a hybrid of private money and public money. And I am a strong believer in the hybrid system.
Okay. Well, then this last question is related to that because crypto is not just Bitcoin anymore. There's a whole alternative financial infrastructure that's being built on the blockchain, from payments, tokenized assets, things like that. Do you think that this is going to be a permanent development? Does it raise any sort of interesting financial risks that central banks and financial regulators are going to have to look at?
Okay. The distribution and the blockchain technology is very promising as a device for transfer of a title or financial asset. So I think this has a huge potential in financial transaction or in providing financial infrastructure. But I stress the transfer, and sometimes people looking at this aspect go too far. So this blockchain technology could provide the safe currency. I don't think so. And as I said minutes ago, in order for currency to serve as a currency, the volatility have to be minimized. And this is related to the issue of provision of liquidity. And the provision of liquidity means we need the safe asset. And looking at long history of money, the existence of public money is essential. And the problem with for instance, Libra was that implicit liquidity provision is assumed. And of course, Libra is could be convenient if we look at transfer aspect. And but if Libra could be used as a currency, literally, then liquidity provision is needed. And central banks is not standing behind. But if it creates the impression that central banks is standing behind, then this entity itself should be subject to supervision and regulation. And this means that this entity should be banned. So I don't think entity other than banks can provide safe money.
Okay, great. Well, Mr. Shirakawa, thank you very much for sharing your time, for sharing the insights of your book and the insights of your career in central banking. There's a lot to think about here. I really thank you once again very much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the discussion with you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The content is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. Nothing contained in this material constitutes a solicitation, recommendation, endorsement, or offer by Deep Macro Incorporated or any third-party service provider to buy or sell any securities or other financial instruments in this or in any other jurisdiction in which such solicitation or offer would be unlawful under the securities laws of such jurisdiction. All content is information of a general nature and does not address the circumstances of any particular individual or entity. None of the information constitutes professional and/or financial advice, nor does any of the information constitute a comprehensive or complete statement of the matters discussed or the law relating thereto. There are risks associated with investing. Loss of principal is possible. Some high-risk investments may use leverage, which will accentuate gains and losses of securities or firms. Past investment performance is not a guarantee or predictor of future investment performance. The content is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. Nothing contained in this material constitutes a solicitation, recommendation, endorsement, or offer by Deep Macro Incorporated or any third-party service provider to buy or sell any securities or other financial instruments in this or in any other jurisdiction in which such solicitation or offer would be unlawful under the securities laws of such jurisdiction. All content is information of a general nature and does not address the circumstances of any particular individual or entity. None of the information constitutes professional and/or financial advice, nor does any of the information constitute a comprehensive or complete statement of the matters discussed or the law relating thereto. There are risks associated with investing. Loss of principal is possible. Some high-risk investments may use leverage, which will accentuate gains and losses of securities or firms. Past investment performance is not a guarantee or predictor of future investment performance.